Hey everybody, welcome to the Sewanee School of Theology Lunch and Learn. It's 12 noon and it's our Lunch and Learn for the month of November. We're very pleased today to welcome Andrew R.H. Thompson, PhD, who's the Associate Professor of Ethics here at the School of Theology. His first book, Sacred Mountains, was about his experience in Appalachia, growing up in Appalachia, and about how we use our built environment. His most recent book, Reconsider the Lilies, Challenging Christian Environmentalism's Colonial Legacy. So you can see a bit of a theme there in Andrew's interests and work. Though his current project's focusing on lay Episcopal theologians Vida Scudder, William Stringfellow, and Werner Dozier, whom we're going to hear about today. He is also, for his sins, now serving on the Church's task force for AI. So if you are using AI, you're probably doing it wrongly, and you have to wait for Andrew to tell you what the best way to do that is. He's a valued member of our seminary community, as is his wife, who's the associate chaplain at Sewanee. And he is very, very expert in the right temperature for frothing milk to making coffee, as he and I discovered, as I discovered in a conversation with him last week. So very pleased to have Andrew presenting to us. So Andrew, there will be an opportunity for question and answers at the end of the session. Please do put your questions into the Q&A box, which is different from the chat box. And I will try and compile them and present them to Andrew as when we get to the end of his presentation. Andrew, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Justin. If I can take a moment and add one piece to the biography, because it's something I feel like I always have to plug. I'm also the director of the Center for Religion and Environment here at Sewanee, and it's a program that has been going for a while, and we're really trying to build it up. So I'm always happy to speak about that. Today's presentation, I don't think I'm talking about the environment at all, although there are some connections that I would be happy to explore in the Q&A if folks are interested. But that is also a key interest of mine and something that we do a lot of here at Sewanee. And so I'm always happy to talk about the center and the work of the center around religion and environment. So I'm going to set up a screen share now for my presentation. And let's see. Does that look all right?
Yep.
Justin?
Yep, that was looking good. I can
Great.
see that.
Okay. All right. So I'm talking about what I've titled Ethics for Christians and Other Aliens. And this is a focus on three ethicists, theologians in particular: Vida Dutton Scudder, William Stringfellow, and Werner Dozier. I will start out by maybe disappointing some people. I'm not talking about extraterrestrials at all. I'm also not going to be talking about illegal or undocumented immigrants and the term aliens that is unfortunately used in that respect. Although much of what we will be talking about is relevant to that issue in contemporary politics. But the title here, Christians and Other Aliens, comes from William Stringfellow's best-known book, An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens, and to me is just a good kind of encapsulation of the kind of radical ethic that I'm trying to describe here. So this presentation, it's a class that I'm currently teaching, also some writing that I'm doing about these three particular thinkers. And I'm focusing on them for a few reasons. One, I think that they are significant thinkers in the Anglican and Episcopal tradition who have been somewhat neglected. Secondly, though, they also represent, I think, a perspective that is often neglected. That is, they are all lay people. They are all Episcopalians in North America. That is, they're not Anglicans in the UK. And they all three come from variously marginalized perspectives that I'm going to speak about as I get into their biographies. So I think that they're important in that respect as well, in a tradition where we mostly talk about moral theology written by British male priests. These three thinkers as lay people and as coming from more marginalized perspectives, I think are important voices in that regard. And finally, and maybe most crucially, some of the things that they have in common, some of the ideas that they express, I think are particularly timely for our contemporary situation. What they mostly represent, as I see it, is what I think of as an ethic of resistance. And it's an ethic that I think is called for in the current moment in society and in the church. So just a brief outline of how I'm going to approach this. We'll move chronologically. So we'll start with Vida Dutton Scudder, and in particular, some of her thinking about private property as a key issue, kind of emblematic issue for her. Then William Stringfellow and his thinking about the state in particular. Then Verna Dozier and what she has to say about vocation. So we'll deal with each of them in their own right. And then sort of to wrap it up, I'll point to some of the common threads that I see here, some of the things that they share in common that I would say are characteristic of what I'm describing as this radical episcopal ethic. I begin with Vida Dutton Scudder. You have her dates there. She was born in 1861 and died in 1954. She was born in India. Her parents were Congregationalist missionaries. And her full name is Julia Davida Dutton Scudder, but she went by Vida, named for her father, David. She was a professor of English literature at Wellesley College. She was baptized at Trinity Church, Boston, when Phillips Brooks was the rector there. She joined all kinds of organizations, but one in particular, Society of the Companions of the Holy Cross, that has continued to look to her. She was not really a founder, but she has become one of the seminal figures for that organization that still continues, the Companions of the Holy Cross. She did help co-found a number of organizations, the College Settlements Association, and that was a key actor in what was called the settlement movement or the settlement house movement. This was houses, usually in cities, usually in poorer parts of cities, that were committed to kind of living in those communities and providing various sorts of outreach or uplift services in those communities. It started actually in Toynbee Hall, a settlement house in England founded by Anglicans. The most famous of these was Hull House in Chicago that Jane Addams was the key figure in, but Vida Dutton Scudder was central to this whole movement. And one of the houses that she was connected with was Denison House, a settlement house in Boston. She also helped found the Episcopal Church Socialist League, and she was an avowed, literally card-carrying Christian socialist, and her writing is very emphatically in support of Christian socialism. She was active in the labor movement, and she spoke out at a textile strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, got herself into some trouble for her outspoken views in that regard, in support of the labor movement and of socialism. You have some of her key works there. She was prolific. This is only a few of her most significant works, kind of from the perspective of Christian ethics and her theology. So a few of her kind of key points. She was a member of what's called the social gospel movement, or a figure in what's called the social gospel movement. And that was a movement around the turn of the 20th century that was advocating from Christian perspectives for radical social reforms. One of the best known figures in this was Walter Rauschenbusch in New York, and Vida Scudder had a ongoing correspondence with him. They were sort of fans of each other. But she was different from a lot of that movement, a lot of the social gospel thinkers, in kind of the spirituality that she brought to her work, even a mystical aspect to it. A lot of her writing is seen as mysticism, and her emphasis on liturgy, on theological doctrine, to a degree that many of the other social gospel thinkers didn't necessarily share. So she was, in many ways, just a very Anglican social gospel thinker in those respects. She was also a pacifist. She was a writer. Her main career, her main field was in writing and teaching literature. And if you read her work, it is very eloquent in a very kind of turn of the century kind of way. A lot of her work focused on the social implications of literature, not just Christian theology, in fact, mostly not Christian theology, but looking at social implications of a lot of different kinds of historical literature, as well as looking at stories of the mystics. She focused on Catherine of Siena, Francis of Assisi, and also the Franciscans. So I said that one of the things that distinguished her from a lot of social gospel thinkers was kind of the depth of her theological commitments. The social gospel movement in general used the kingdom of God as kind of its touchstone for social reform, right? Trying to bring about the kingdom of God on earth in society. And she certainly shared that. You see in the bottom quote here, the idea that the kingdom of God was no mere phantom nor promise of heavenly consolation for the individual, but a kingdom of effective justice to be possessed on earth by bodily men, using the language of her time. So she shared that idea, but she digs much more deeply into sort of the whole of Christian theology and doctrine. One of her great works that she kind of published in different forms, but looks at the entire liturgical year, the entire church year, and each of the seasons, and kind of pulls out the implications of that for her social Christianity and Christian socialism from each of the different liturgical seasons. So she was able to connect kind of all different aspects of Christian theology to this impulse for Christian socialism and social reform. The Trinity was for her of particular importance, and you have in Vida Scudder an early version of what throughout the 20th century becomes called social Trinitarianism, or the social doctrine of the Trinity. She argued, as you have kind of a extensive quote here, that the threefold name of the Trinity becomes the heavenly prototype of earthly society. As soon as we recognize God to be the Spirit within us, as well as the Father and the Redeemer, and our Christian duty is plainly seen to be the release and reproduction of the divine nature in the corporate life of the race. So there you can see a little bit of the loquaciousness that I was alluding to earlier. But what she's saying here is that the Trinity is a social doctrine, that God is a society, and that we ought to model our life in society on the relations of the Trinity. And that's as I say, an idea that has a lot of advocates sort of throughout the 20th century. But for Scudder, that was central to her advocacy for Christian socialism. Looking at one aspect of her thinking in particular, and this is one of the places where she kind of gets the most specific and the most kind of practical. And that's this idea of private property and her critique of private property. So backing up just a bit, one of her key claims for Christian socialism is that if it is impossible in the current society to live the values of the gospel, to live the Beatitudes in the current economic system, then we have to change the system. Christians have to change the system so that they can live out those gospel values. That's kind of one of her underlying claims. One way that she puts this in one of her pieces, looking at property and the economic system specifically, if Christian people in general should discover by any chance that the sources of income under the present system can rarely bear scrutiny when exposed to the flashlight of conscience, they may decide that the present system has got to go. A statement there that I think could have equal resonance, if not more, in today's capitalist economy. So then in one particular little pamphlet that she wrote, where she addresses this topic specifically, private property, she says, regardless of how you feel about private property as an idea, as a principle, she says, the current state of affairs, where the great majority of the population has no property at all, at the very least demands a reevaluation. Even if you believe that private property is important, then you, for that very reason, should question a system where most people don't have access to it. But she also participates in a long-standing tradition of relativizing, if not outright challenging, the doctrine or the idea of private property itself. And she points to a long line of theologians throughout the history of the church who have argued that either that there is no kind of inherent right to private property, or if there's going to be private property, it must be in the service of the community, of the common good. So that's what she refers to here, where she says, the best Christian thinking has long seen in the power bestowed by wealth the most dangerous and literally satanic element inherent in possession. This is one of her, I think, best insights from this pamphlet is she looks at this question of private property, not just in terms of wealth and not just in terms of the ability of people to make a living, although that's certainly key to her concern, but also power, the way that private property is more fundamentally about the power of some people over other people. And that accounts for both why it is such a persistent and um, seemingly permanent kind of ideology, and also why it is so needed, why it so desperately needs to be transformed, because it's not just about standard of living, about wealth, but it's about the power of some people over others. And she responds here to challenges, for example, that private property is a way that people express their personhood. And she says, well, if you look at the saints, you actually can see not only is that not the case, but in fact, personality, true expressions of human personhood really are at odds with the system of private property. It actually limits our ability to be truly human. And that has to do, again, particularly with the way that it distributes power so unevenly. There's a lot more to say about Scudder. I'm going to continue on, and we'll revisit some of her ideas sort of towards the end. Of the three thinkers I'm looking at, she's in some ways the most challenging to kind of read and incorporate into a contemporary ethic, because she's writing in a very different time, a time of great optimism for Christian socialism and for the social gospel movement, a time before, for the most part, before world wars, when it was possible to have a certain amount of optimism. And you see this in a lot of the social gospel thinkers, this idea that we're on the verge of literally creating the kingdom of God on earth. And she seems to, at times, seems to reflect that. But one of the key insights that I mentioned before that I think is a great insight of hers, and something that can really be meaningful in a contemporary context, is just this sense that if it is impossible under the current economic and political system to live Christian values, then one of the things that Christians have to do is try to change that system. So, to whatever extent possible. And when we get to the next two thinkers, there's going to be a lot more cynicism about how much that actually is possible. But we at least have to try to make it more possible to live the values that we are called to. And I think that's one of Scudder's most challenging and probing insights. The next thinker we will look at is William Stringfellow. So his date's there, sort of the middle of the 20th century. Educated at Bates College in Maine, and then the London School of Economics, and went to law school at Harvard Law. He was a lay Episcopal lawyer, and most of his practice was as what he called as a street lawyer. He was a lawyer for poor tenants in Harlem, mainly supported by a ministry called the East Harlem Protestant Parish, which was a group ministry that had been founded by Union Seminary students in New York City. So that was his main work, was this kind of grassroots, on the ground, very kind of radical lawyer work, and protecting people who were not represented equally or didn't have equal access to the law. But he had an interesting life in many other ways. He was very active in the civil rights movement, and actually was involved in one of the first sit-ins. He tells the story in some of his autobiographical writing, and it's sort of a charmingly underwhelming story of this first sit-in. It wasn't as dramatic as he expected it to be, but he has some great reflections on that. He also was really sort of obsessed with the circus. He believed that the circus was one of the best symbols we have in this life for the kingdom of God. And so, in fact, spent one summer following the circus and traveling around with a circus, and writes about that as well. In his activism, he was particularly focused on anti-war, anti-Vietnam War activism. And so he was a powerful advocate in that. And one of his best known advocacy moments was at the trial of what were called the Catonsville Nine, where Catholic anti-war protesters, including Dan and Philip Berrigan, who were two good friends of Stringfellow. So he spoke really powerfully at that trial. And we're going to come back to that because he speaks about that experience as well. And then had run in with the FBI because when Daniel Berrigan was fleeing from the FBI, he came and stayed with William Stringfellow and his partner Anthony Towne for a while, and the FBI found him there, and so arrested Berrigan, but also arrested Stringfellow and Towne, and interrogated them about their relationship with Berrigan. And again, that's something that Stringfellow thinks theologically about. He also, another aspect of his activism, and particularly relevant to the Episcopal Church, is that he was legal counsel and sort of supporter of the Philadelphia 11. That is, the 11 female deacons who were ordained in 1974 to become the first female priests in the Episcopal Church. And Stringfellow, as a lawyer, argued that there was no legal or canonical justification for declaring those ordinations invalid. And he was officially attorney on behalf of one of the retired bishops who had ordained some of those 11 women. And so he was involved in that, and was a really powerful critic of the church and the ways that he felt like the hierarchy of the church had gone wrong in that particular case. Just incidentally, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, described Stringfellow as probably the most creative and disturbing Anglican theologian. And Karl Barth, arguably the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century, did a panel with William Stringfellow and ended up telling the people in the audience that they needed to be listening to Stringfellow. So it gives you a sense of the influence of his thinking, even if he's not quite as well known today. Although I have a sense, I keep hearing from people that I think he is, he's having a bit of a moment. I keep hearing from people that Stringfellow is popping up in various places. So there's a lot to Stringfellow's theology, and I'm going to try to give at least just a brief kind of synopsis. For the most part, it centers on the biblical New Testament language of powers and principalities. And Stringfellow argues that we ought to understand that language of powers and principalities as referring to actual institutions that we encounter and live with in this world. So the nation, law, money, science, ideologies, also the university, also the church. Any institution is and can be a principality. And so he says, likewise says, includes all institutions, ideologies, images, movements, causes, corporations, bureaucracies, races, nations, all idols. The principalities and powers are legion. If he perhaps goes a little bit far in the direction of kind of the principalities are everything, that's one of the challenges in reading his theology, the ways that he seems to equate these things in ways that, we might want to draw some distinctions. But at the same time, I think he's right to point to there's something there that these have in common. There's something that, for whatever their differences, and they are meaningful differences, these institutions share some characteristic or some character. And so what the Bible says, according to Stringfellow, about the powers and principalities is a few things, but that they are created and they are fallen. What he means in saying that they're created is not that, ExxonMobil was around in the Garden of Eden or something like that. It's not a historical claim about how they come to be, because of course we know corporations, for example, are formed through a legal process, that people do this, right? But his point here is rather that they have a kind of agency that seems to exceed our efforts to control them, right? So that's what he means by saying that they're creatures. They exist somehow independently from the people and the structures that supposedly have created and control them. And that to him is one of the key things from the Bible that we ought to understand about them. That no matter how much we think we can tame them, no matter how much we think we can get them to do our bidding, in fact, they have a kind of autonomy. And in fact, they're supposed to serve us, they're supposed to serve human life. But in fact, we end up serving them. We end up being captive to the institutions, to the powers and principalities. So that's what he means when he describes them as part of God's work of creation. That, as it says here, that human beings do not control institutions or any other principalities. And they are fallen. And for him, what that means is that they claim autonomy from God, and they claim this dominion over human beings. They step outside of their position as creatures, as created by God, intended to serve humans. And in fact, they claim autonomy, and they set themselves up essentially as idols, as competitors to God. They, as he says here in this second to last quote, they boast that humans can find meaning and the fulfillment of human life in them, in the principality. And that's how they set themselves up as idols, as alternative guarantors of meaning, of fulfillment, and ultimately of life, of immortality. This is his final point here. They are themselves consigned to death as finite institutions. So the idolatry of the demonic powers always turns out to be a worship of death. I'm going to say now a little bit more about what he means by death, because this is a kind of a key point. Because for him, that's what it all comes back to. The institutions are the powers of death, the principalities of death. By that, he means, he says, biological death, the end of our finite human mortal lives. But he means a lot more than that. And mostly he means, I think, all the other things that we wrap up with this idea of death. So as he says, refers to clinical death and biological extinction, but much more than that, what he calls the moral reality of death, comprehended sociologically and anthropologically, economically and politically. Death as a moral power means death as a social purpose. There's a lot here in how he understands death. I think the best way to think of it is dehumanization, is everything that cheapens life, human life, and I think we would add now in the 21st century, life more broadly, right? Not just human life. Everything that cheapens life is what he has in mind with death. And in fact, death, in terms of our mortality, is actually not primarily what he's concerned with. So when he talks about the powers and principalities being powers of death, being idols of death, some of that has to do with the way that they promise, in some ways, they promise a freedom from death. One of the best examples of this he gives is money. We imagine that we can accumulate enough money that it will somehow allow us to escape our mortality, to escape our finitude, right? And because that's false, because that's a lie, that's one of the ways that they are idols of death. They're promising an escape from death that they don't deliver. Another way, and this one applies especially to the state, although Stringfellow sort of generalizes and says that they all do this. But the state, of course, is the one institution that claims the sanction of death, that claims the monopoly on the use of violence and ultimately of death in the form of capital punishment. And he says that that is behind all the power that the state exercises, right? It's power to tax, its power to subjugate is all predicated on its ability finally to exercise that ultimate penalty of death, right? He says all the institutions participate in this in some way, and that seems to me like a little bit of a stretch, although perhaps there's a case that could be made there because it's sort of the way that they all resemble one another. But certainly in the case of the state, that is true. That is the case. And so, as I said, he and we'll talk more about the state here in just a minute. He was an anti-war activist, and his thinking in the context of the Vietnam War is one of the places where this idea of death comes out most prominently. He says the Vietnam War, it is sort of the extreme. It is one of the most grotesque, as he puts it, illustrations of this, But what it really does is illustrates the presence of death that has always been the case in America and in all the principalities. The presence of this moral reality of death that underlies all the institutions. In Vietnam, in his context, Vietnam just brings that to the foreground. And then he names all these others. And again, one of the things that is so striking about Stringfellow, and we're going to see this especially in the next slide, is how much of what he says is so relevant to our contemporary moment. So when he names the other symptoms of death in America, he says the apartheid stalemate in race, prevalent waste ethic in production and marketing and consumerism, degeneration of medical care, the emergent technological totalitarianism, militarization of police power, official assault against due process of law, and proliferation of illegitimate authority. There are all these moments in reading Stringfellow where he's writing in the 60s or the 70s, and it feels as if he could be talking about the front pages of today's newspapers. And this is one of those. So to him, these are all examples of what that idolatry of death looks like in the practices, the practices of the state. So for Stringfellow, the state has a particular preeminence among the principality. It's in a way the one that expresses most clearly the fallenness and the death-centeredness of the principalities. And in the way that he talks about this, again, this is one of those places where it just feels particularly prescient. So when he describes the tools that the principalities use, and the state in particular, he names some of these. The denial of truth in a variety of ways. He says the truth is usurped and displaced by a self-serving version of events or facts, with whatever selectivity, distortion, falsehood, manipulation, exaggeration necessary to maintain the image or enhance the survival or multiply the coercive capacities of the principality. He describes the way this whole kind of collection of abuses of the truth serve not only to deceive, but to undermine so completely the idea of truth, the idea of trustworthiness, the idea that there could be such a thing as truth, is so undermined that it feels impossible. It feels like truth, the idea of truth loses meaning. He uses the terms from George Orwell from 1984 of double speak and overtalk, and says that's literally how the principalities function, by saying one thing and meaning its exact opposite. And again, what that does is to destabilize any possibility of speaking truthfully. He names a few more of these: surveillance and harassment. Again, properties that become, I think, even more relevant in our age. And interestingly, and this is an example of something that Stringfellow often does, where he takes these biblical images and ideas like powers and principalities and interprets them literally. He says these aren't figurative language, these aren't metaphors, these are actual things that we encounter in reality. And in this case, he says cursing and conjuring that we encounter in the Bible, those are real things. They're real things that the principalities do. So, for example, when the state constructs certain people as enemies, as other, and therefore as not deserving of protection or of the same rights or respects that are due to others, right? The state literally constructs them as cursed, as outsiders, and therefore as deserving of death. And then, of course, the state has the power of death at its disposal, right? So he says that's literally what cursing means. It means constructing them a certain way so that they, because of the power of the state, they become that. They become condemned to death. And again, not always death, but it always has that implication, that possibility behind it. So throughout, he says, essentially, all of this is in the Bible, right? He's speaking in the Nixon administration, but he would say it's every demagogue throughout history, right? The Bible has a clearer perspective of what they do and how they do it than most of us realize, and then really any other perspective has been able to capture. He says, if we're reading the Bible rightly, we see all this there, and it helps us understand what's going on in these institutions, in these principalities. So another example of this, he says, the story of the Tower of Babel is an example of what he calls the inversion of language and the chaos of voices. The idea, as he says in this quote, the restlessness or relentlessness of multifarious Babel in America has wrought a fatigue, both visceral and intellectual, in millions upon millions of Americans. The idea that the powers, particularly the state, overwhelm us so much with just a flood, a torrent of chaos, of nonsense, of deceit, such that not only that it, as I said before, it becomes hard to even believe in the truth, but it also just wears you down. It overwhelms you with this fatigue of flooding the zone is the language that has been used sort of in the contemporary situation, right? Again, he describes this in a way that just feels very relevant to today. So that's briefly Stringfellow. Turning now to the third figure in this tradition that I'm describing, Verna Dozier, and the latest of the three figures. Her dates 1917 to 2006. She studied at Howard University, and she was a public school teacher in Washington, D.C., as well as being an adjunct at Virginia Seminary and teaching in the Episcopal Church's College for Preachers. And so she had an influence as a Bible teacher, sort of all through the church, that just as an ordinary laywoman without any real particular position in the hierarchy, but her teaching around the Bible and how we engage with the Bible was just so influential, all through DC and the DC area, but really throughout the church. And some of you may recall Michael Curry and Stephanie Spellers in the presiding bishop's office of the last period often spoke highly of Verna Dozier and her influence on them and their thinking. So she has an influence that really exceeds sort of what her official kind of position in the church was. And she has a similar critique to Stringfellow in many ways of powers and principalities, but she focuses her criticism mostly on the church. And that's not to say she certainly speaks in many places of the other principalities, but her big concern was the ways that she felt the church had strayed, the church had gone wrong. So she says this in a lot of different ways. Says, why have we strayed so far afield from where the church began? For me, the answer lies in our great human need for definite answers. We resist living with doubt, incompleteness, confusion, ambiguity. She traces this story, as you see in the second quote, of the church continually sort of being afraid to live with uncertainty and ambiguity. And she sees the turn to more institutionalized forms of the church as a retreat from that uncertainty and a looking for security, for certainty, for dogmatic, doctrinal certainty, and also for sort of institutional stability. And she wants the church to resist that as much as possible. She, maybe more than Stringfellow, she thinks the institution is necessary and perhaps even positive, but she thinks that we need to preserve that ambiguity, that dynamism, even within that institutional context. So as she puts it, the Christian witness calls us to walk by faith, but most of what we do in the institution denies that. And so she wants us to live with the institutions, within the institutions, in a way that holds them sort of with relative skepticism. She has a lot around the idea of vocation, although she doesn't necessarily talk about it as vocation, but the calling of the church and the calling of Christians within the church. She sees the church as called to be a saving people, a community that is capable of transforming the world. And she says that's what Jesus was about with the kingdom of God, and there's a certain resonance with Vita Scudder and the social gospel movement. And that's what the church needs to be about, is living in a certain way that reflects that. And that's going to be a way that challenges the institutions, the powers and principalities. She alludes back to William Stringfellow in a few places as somebody who really got this right. So she agrees with that sense that if the church is living the kingdom values, if the church is living as the kingdom that it's called to represent, then that's going to put it into conflict with the powers and principalities. So you see that here in this third quote: the kingdoms of this world and all the glory in them belong to the devil. There she's speaking of the temptation narratives in the Gospels as demonstrating that the power of the devil in this world, and the sense that the church, as the followers of Jesus, are called to resist that. Again, the way that brings Jesus into confrontation with the kingdoms of the world, and therefore should similarly bring the church into that same confrontation. Now I'm going to point to some of the things that I think these three have in common, what I see as sort of an incipient radical episcopal ethic, and what I think some of its important kind of implications are for us. First, there are certain biographical similarities among the three. As I mentioned, they're all representing marginalized perspectives in different ways. So Vida Scudder, both as a woman in the turn of the 20th century, in a time when women did not really have that kind of voice in either in the church or in the academy, the two kind of spheres that she primarily functioned in. And she also was in a long-term same-sex relationship with Florence Converse, her partner. William Stringfellow, likewise, was in a long-term same-sex relationship with the poet Anthony Towne. He argued that he was vocationally celibate, is how he put it, but nonetheless, had this lifelong relationship with Anthony, and it was clearly an intimate relationship. And then Verna Dozier as both a woman and an African American in the spaces where she was operating. So all three of them represent different kinds of marginalized perspectives. Another kind of key biographical connection is that they all had some engagement with what Stringfellow calls para-congregations. And you could find different ways to describe these, something like missional or emergent communities, perhaps. But he uses that term as things that are usually not quite congregations, kind of on the margins of conventional congregations or conventional churches, sort of experimental, and typically more or less fleeting, not kind of long-term, stable kind of communities, but kind of experimental efforts in Christian community. Scudder, as I said, joined all kinds of and founded all kinds of things. I think at one point in her life, she was a member of over 50 different organizations. But some of the key ones, I mentioned the Society of the Companions of the Holy Cross, and that's, again, one that continues to look to her as one of its key members. Denison House, the settlement house that she was heavily involved with. But one that she spoke sort of most compellingly about was the Church of the Carpenter, which was an explicitly socialist congregation in Boston that was centered around the Eucharist. And so it had this liturgical element that she valued so much, but from an explicitly socialist perspective. And she spoke of that as really bringing these two forces of Christianity, and specifically liturgical Christianity, together with Christian socialism, or with socialism. Stringfellow speaks specifically of the Catonsville 9 demonstrations and some of his anti-war activism as this kind of para-congregation, a moment when this kind of kingdom resistance to the principalities emerged. He also talks about what was basically a house church on Block Island when he was living there. The church that they had been participating was flooded, and sort of jokingly called St. Anne's in the Sea, because the sea level rose and the church flooded. And so at the time, then the community continued to worship in these house churches. And he really spoke of that in this very romantic way as an example of the kind of community that he had been arguing for and looking for. And once they kind of reverted to a more formal congregation, he felt like that energy was lost, that para-congregation that he was so excited about was lost. And then similarly, Dozier was involved in the Church of the Savior in DC, a movement founded by Gordon Cosby that was centered around group prayer, group Bible study, and then various kinds of social ministries around DC. And so it was what today I think people might describe as an emergent or missional kind of community. And so she was deeply involved in that and spoke of how it informed her theology. I mention this because it's not only something that they have in common, but I think it deeply shaped all three of their theologies. All three of them are speaking of the church as kind of a countercultural community, a kind of experimental, again, often fleeting kind of community of resistance to the dominant powers. And I think they all had different amounts of experience with that kind of community. I'm going to try to go quickly through these, so I won't read all the quotes, but you have them there to make sure that we have some time for questions. But three characteristics that I think they centrally these three thinkers share. One is what Stringfellow calls empiricism. That is the fact that theology is not primarily about otherworldly realities. It's not about kind of spiritual in the sense of not worldly or not material realities. It's not about abstract kind of claims. It's about things that we actually encounter in life, in the world. And so the way that he talks about powers and principalities, the way he talks about cursing and conjuring, he says the Bible here is talking about actual things that we experience. And properly understood, the Bible and theology help us make sense of those lived realities. That's what he means by empiricism. And I think all three, Scudder, Stringfellow, and Dozier, have some aspect of that, that the main point of Christian teaching, the main point of Christian belief is what it means for how we live, how we encounter the world, and how we respond to it. Of the three, Scudder is kind of the most theological, the most interested in Christian doctrine and kind of the breadth of Christian theology. But as you see here, she still insists that what is most significant about that, even the Trinity, which can sometimes be sort of one of the most abstract theological concepts, what's most significant about those, she says, is the way they connect with life, the way they change how we live. The next characteristic is that all three of them were, again, in varying degrees, but emphatic about the importance of liturgy and specifically of the sacrament, specifically of Eucharist in this. And it relates to that empiricism, right? If theology is about something we encounter in the world, then liturgy is part of how we practice that, how we encounter it on a regular basis, and how we present it to the world as something that matters for this life, and especially in the Eucharist, in a very material, concrete way. Here, Dozier is the one that kind of speaks the least about the importance of liturgy and sacrament, but she does have this sense that what's happening in the church, in the Eucharist especially, is crucial to then that witness that gets carried out into the world. The third kind of key characteristic that I think they all share is some kind of resistance to capitalist political economy. Now that's my terminology because they're kind of talking about different things. Scudder is mostly focused on capitalism specifically because she's a socialist. Stringfellow is focused on kind of all the systems. And Dozier, for the most part, follows Stringfellow in this sense of confrontation with the powers and principalities, the dominant one being the state as well as economic institutions. But all three of them share this sense that the church has a distinctive vocation to resist those dominant powers, and a sense that in some way those powers are related. The institutions are related. However much they might differ, they have some common characteristics, and the church is called to be a counter to those. One final kind of common thread that they all have that I neglected to mention, they are all lay people, as I said, and they're all pretty emphatic about the importance of lay people in that witness, right? The church, the sacraments, the liturgy, that's all absolutely essential. But to them, where the real work of resisting those dominant powers happens is in the lives of the lay people in the world, and often in their professions, right? As politicians, economists, teachers, whatever it may be. But that's where that witness really happens. So finally, to wrap up, I asked myself sort of as I was working on this, if I was to try to encapsulate what I see as the key claim or claims of what I'm describing as this radical Episcopal ethic, can I do that in a concise and coherent way? And this is my attempt at that. I think all three of them reflect something of this, although maybe with different emphases. And in fact, we sort of go with the emphases, this sort of goes backwards. So the first point, that our value is affirmed unconditionally, right? That's the truth of the gospel. And Dozier of the three is the one that emphasizes that aspect the most. Because of that, we are free from the forces of the powers. We are free from their control and free to recognize that they are idolatrous and that they are liars because we don't rely on them anymore for our value. And we are free to live in a truly human way. And that's Stringfellow especially, but again, something that the other two, I think, share. And those powers are fallen. And so I think Stringfellow and Dozier are right to be skeptical about how much we can actually expect of them. But they are intended to serve life. These authors, Stringfellow would say human life. I would expand it to life more broadly. And so we are free to demand that they do so, that they do what they are meant to do. Again, the possibilities for that are probably more limited than what Scudder envisioned, but I think she's right to try to hold them to that, to try to find ways of making the institutions a space in which it may again be possible to live according to Christian values, to live humanly, as these thinkers would put it. So if there's a coherent sort of narrative or coherent sort of set of claims between these three, I think it's something like this. So with that, I apologize I didn't leave as much time for questions as I intended, but I'm sort of proud that I got through all this as quickly as I did.
Andy, thank you so much. I mean, you said your ambition was to be concise and coherent, and you certainly were both those things. I'm very pleased to hear about William Stringfellow being a graduate of the LSE, which is my original school. So it's good to see that the LSE is still a troublesome place. As people are adding questions to the Q&A, and we've got about 6 or 7 minutes for that, just wondered, Stringfellow was talking about the proliferation of illegitimate authority, which implies to me that there's such a thing as legitimate authority. And what would he have said would have been legitimate authority? And then what would be the relationship between legitimate authority and what I understood as one of the definitions of the state as being the institution that has monopoly on violence?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that he's not always sort of explicit about. Um, one place to see it perhaps is in his challenge to the institutional church around the case of the Philadelphia 11, because at the same time that he's going to say the church is a principality, it is fallen, right? He's also going to use the argument, as I mentioned, that there's no canonical authority for denying those ordinations, right? So he is going to, and he makes similar move with respect to the state, right? He was a lawyer. He understood the Constitution. And so he was willing to use those mechanisms of the Constitution, of the law, to hold the powers to account, even while arguing that they are sort of in their very being, they're fallen, they're corrupt, they are demonic is another term that he would use, right? So I think there's a sense in which if Scudder errs on the side of optimism about what we can expect from the institutions, I think Stringfellow perhaps overstates his pessimism in that regard, because he does seem to have believed that it was a worthwhile endeavor to hold institutions accountable to their own sort of constitution or their own sort of structures, right? So you could use that as a mechanism to at the very least limit their ability to oppress, limit their ability to manipulate and exploit, right? Again, he's pretty skeptical about that, but he did in his work, in his life, make use of those mechanisms. So I think that's when he talks about illegitimate authority. I think he's talking about the ways that, and again, this is something that I think would be very relevant today. But he's talking about the ways that the state, the people exercising authority in the state, are violating the Constitution, are violating even those structures that are in place, however minimal, however fallen those may be. They at the very least, they need to be held to that kind of standard, right? So when he talks about illegitimate authority, it's the ways that they violate their own kind of structures.
A couple of questions coming in talking about the culture that we're living in of the contemporary rising Christian nationalism and how certain kind of trad bro Christianity is deprecating any kind of Christian compassion. So how does how do how do we use these three people in a critique of those kinds of muscular and hostile Christianities?
Hmm. Um, yeah, that's a good question too, particularly because um, with Stringfellow in particular, there's a kind of orthodoxy that he insists on that as I read him sometimes, and like a suspicion of institutions, right? Certain aspects of Stringfellow, I feel like could be taken in very different directions from how I interpret him, right? And maybe more in the kind of directions that the questioner is thinking of. So it is a risk. It's also a risk because another thing that all three of these thinkers share is an acceptance of ambiguity, right? None of them are going to say, um, here's right, here's wrong, here's how we're supposed to live, and here's what we're supposed to avoid. All three of them are going to say it's complicated and it's a matter for discernment. Um, but I think you know, I think that point about compassion is maybe one of the few kind of touchstones that we can perhaps point to, and that's most prominent, especially in Verna Dozier, her sense that yes, this community is called to be a community of resistance, a counterculture community, but most of all, and this is what presiding Bishop Curry always emphasized when he talked about Dozier, most of all, it's a community built on love, and that it's that love, it's that recognition that I am accepted, that allows me to be genuinely loving towards others, and that sense of living humanly that all three of these thinkers share is at its heart, comes out of that love, right? I think to the extent that we get any sort of touchstone that helps us in that, um, helps us push back against that kind of movement, I think that's where it is.
Andy, that's fantastic. We've got really regret we've got some really interesting questions that come in. People obviously grappling with these ideas and grappling with the consequences for it. I think we could answer most people's questions if you say in a single word, "Are you writing a book about these people?" And is the answer yes?
I'm currently writing an article that I hope will become a book, and I am encouraged by the response so far that probably I do need to set my sights on a book. So
So those of you who have asked these really interesting questions, I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get around to them, but if we encourage Andy to write his article, which will then be turned into a book, we might have a way of engaging with them further. As we promised to get you out of here by the top of the hour, as the DJs say, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Andy for being so concise, so coherent, and so challenging on the backs of these three important lay theologians to offer to you the next year's Lunch and Learn will continue with Encountering Spirits in the Bible on the 3rd of February with the Reverend Dr. Reed Carlson, who is a lecturer in Old Testament here at the School of Theology. And if you want to support the School of Theology, then please use that QR code to support Sewanee today. And I want to say finally, a final thank you to Annie for an excellent presentation. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you to everybody for your engagement. And yeah, I apologize for not being able to get to the questions, but I'm grateful for the level of engagement from everybody.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you all. Bye.